was also frozen. Okay. So let's go to the slide again. See. Okay. I'm pressing share and it doesn't seem to.
We can see your screen. It's just not the presentation
Oh,
screen, Hadi.
right. So let me go back to the present. I wanted to share the presentation, but something has gone wrong here.
Yeah, PowerPoint can be glitchy, but the screen works just fine, Hadi. We can see the
Okay,
graph quite clearly.
great. Okay. So, as I started to say that we look at aggregate output, and on the vertical axis, we put the change in inflation rate. And suppose this is the theoretical production capacity, the physical production capacity of the economy. It's like if, if you looking at it, you should be looking at this as if someone can work, for example, theoretically 20 hours a day and sleep very little. But that's not sustainable. So this is not necessarily sustainable. This is the physical uh, capacity to produce at any in a particular time. The actual production capacity, as we've discussed before, is the amount that the economy can produce on a sustainable basis, the maximum amount that the economy can produce on a sustainable basis. And that's a, a more accurate definition of production capacity. Now, we want inflation change to be zero for the economy to be on a stable path. Because if inflation is constantly increasing or decreasing, then we're going to have problems. Either inflation is going to go too high or it's going to go too low and cause prices to decline. So we want to be around this zero inflation, zero change in inflation. And we can choose the target inflation, for example, for the US economy or for European economies. Economists believe that 2% change in price level, 2% rate inflation is perfect. And we want the change in inflation, once we've reached that inflation rate, we want to set the change in inflation rate as zero. Now, then if we can produce at production capacity, we can keep the inflation rate constant. This means that the aggregate demand curve, which is in this case, is the production capacity versus the change in employment, in inflation rate. It's going to be something like downward sloping, like this blue line that I have drawn. Now, if demand is such that it crosses the production capacity at zero change in inflation rate, then we're going to be on a stable growth path. Inflation remains at the optimal level that we want to keep the economy, and production is all the resources of the economy are fully employed in when we're at production capacity. Now, if we change the demand at this point or change production capacity, something is going to change, and this point is not going to no longer is going to be the best situation for the inflation rate. For example, let's say demand rises. This is what happened in 2021 when after the COVID pandemic, because the Fed had stimulated the economy very sharply, government expenditure had gone up sharply. That all had pushed aggregate demand high, and it created an excess production relative to what the economy could deliver. And that caused excess demand, which excess demand in the economy causes inflation to rise, continue rising. So the change in inflation rate becomes positive. And if this is not checked and not and if the Fed or the government don't do anything about this, the situation continues, inflation is going to continue to rise and even accelerate. As you can see, the aggregate supply curve is kind of becomes almost vertical. So only you get inflation and not much increase in output if demand goes up. I drew this theoretical production capacity because that's a level of output that we cannot normally reach, because if resources are fully employed all the time, we're overusing them, and then it's not sustainable. So what happens is that inflation keeps accelerating in order to keep the demand low, and the distance between production capacity and the level of income that prevails in the economy is going to be rising. So this is the equilibrium, but this is a short-run equilibrium because inflation keeps rising here and the economy becomes unstable. We could also look at the same situation, the same graph, but the other way. If demand falls, then what's going to happen is that the economy is going to be producing less. We're going to have excess supply, and we're going to have negative change in inflation rate. Inflation rate constantly is going down, and it could lead to deflation or prices going down actually. This is the case with China right now. What has happened is that it seems that production capacity has been increased. The government anticipated higher growth, so overinvested in production capacity, in infrastructure, in housing, etc. And that all that overcapacity means that inflation is going to be constantly declining. The government, one may say that, okay, if this is the situation and inflation is declining and we don't want to have deflation, we should basically increase the demand back to the original level, to this level, and restore the zero change in inflation, so stable inflation. The problem is that the government and the private sector are highly indebted, and to stimulate demand, they have to raise tons of more debt, and that could itself destabilize the economy because the finances may not be feasible. Extra borrowing that is needed for stimulating the economy may not be there. And that's, I think, one of the biggest problems that Chinese government is facing. That's basically it with my presentation, and more practical issues are going to be raised by and addressed by Vlad. Okay, Vlad,
Thank you
your
so
turn.
much, Hadi. So essentially, what we are seeing from Hadi's presentation is a decline in aggregate demand, right? And sort of that decline in aggregate demand basically is what contributing to this excess supply compared to this level of aggregate demand. And that means that there is some deflation taking place. And let me share my screen. I should be sharing the screen right now, and let me go into the presentation mode and skip through my ChatGPT generated graphic and the background reading materials, and start talking about China's practical issues in China's economic performance. So in China for 2024 and 2025, the GDP growth targets were pretty ambitious at 5% of GDP growth. They are probably about half as much as the rate at which China was growing, say, 15 years ago. But still, for an industrialized economy, that would have been something to celebrate. In general, government statistics from China in the past were not terribly reliable. Current statistics seem to have more credibility. And how we can tell that, for example, if you look, economists developed a few ways to measure, to validate the GDP numbers that were reported by China through the so-called alternative GDP measure. which essentially looked at indicators such as industrial production, property markets, retail sales, exports, and things like that. And what we could tell in here is that if you can look at the official government numbers, which are shown in black, they seem to be a little bit more smooth compared to those alternative GDP numbers. And that's what tells us that in the past, China probably has been fudging statistics quite a bit. And this simply doesn't seem to be the case now. Both of those indicators seem to be pretty consistent with each other. And so, to me, that, and to the economists, it tells that 5% GDP growth targets and the current GDP growth rate seem to be pretty reliable, to the, for most part, but, perhaps, not perfect, but still. Inflation, on the other hand, had been, as Hadi indicated, had been very low in 23, in 24, it has been close to zero. And in 25, what we are seeing is that the consumer price index was barely above zero, almost indistinguishably so. But if you look at other measures of inflation, like the producer price index, which kind of precedes the consumer price index, that number had been negative. And that becomes a concern. And we'll talk about why that would be a concern. If you look at unemployment, unemployment seems to be pretty stable, a little bit above 5%. Youth unemployment has increased quite a bit in the recent year or so, so that's a concerning item. Exports have been doing actually pretty good. So they increased, as of July of this year over year, they increased by roughly 7%. I think the exports to United States had decreased by roughly 22%. But the good news for China is that that was more than compensated with higher exports to other countries. And if you look at individual sectors in China's economy, you can see that, no surprise, real estate is hit very, very hard. But manufacturing, infrastructure, and technology seem to be doing okay, with a few caveats that I'll talk about a bit later. So let's talk about those economic growth issues. As the article from The Economist that is shared to you suggests, economic growth targets are pretty ambitious. But the problem might not be that they are ambitious, but rather that officials try very hard to meet them. And why is this the case? Recall that China's economy depends quite a bit on government investment. Consumption doesn't account for as much of GDP as it accounts for in high income economies. And so when government officials manage those economic growth targets, you basically get your typical agency problem, also called the principal agent conflict, which means, the incentives there are pretty strong and pretty negative. If you're not meeting the growth targets, the heads are going to roll, right? Local government officials don't want to be the ones fired, publicly shamed, put on the social credit blacklist. And so what they do in order to meet those growth targets is that they will invest more into infrastructure to make up for something like this, right? And generally speaking, this has a number of potential issues. The good side of it is that it smooths the economic growth numbers, which is what you like to see. You want to avoid significant swings to either side of GDP. But what that can also mean is that you're putting more money into the underperforming sectors of the economy, which could be a problem. There is some potential for price wars, for attracting investors to, between officials of different Chinese regions, even though that might not necessarily be happening right now, but the potential is there. It also means that local governments are going to be borrowing much more, and that the relationship between fundamental economic growth, which is driven by aggregate demand and the true aggregate supply, and the GDP growth reflected in government statistics, is going to come apart, and the two of them will not resemble each other very, very much. Chinese government, Premier Xi says that we shouldn't judge whether a person is a hero just by the GDP growth rate, and that's a quote back from 2013. But looking at what was happening, I think that actually was the primary criterion for judging whether the people are going to are doing their work well. So, and perhaps Chinese government is going to emphasize this a little bit more these days, and looking at alternative measure of well-being, but might not necessarily be the case. So transitioning from here to the idea of government debt. And by the way, folks, feel free to unmute yourself and ask questions at any time or put those things in the chat. These questions are welcome. We're a pretty small group today, which is not unusual for our summer session, the late August session, where a lot of people are taking a break. There is a lot of criticism in China, or at least a perception of some degree of corruption in local government spending. And one of the interesting quotes from the Economist article that we share, it's kind of like mice looking over after rice, doesn't inspire much confidence. Um, there might not be all that much corruption in there, but there are significant structural problems, I think, for sure. One of them is the level of local government debt. Some of it is on the books, some of it is off the books. The off balance sheet items, it's basically hidden debt that could approach as much as 50% of China's GDP. And this, for example, could be debt hidden by those combination entities that are public-private partnerships, like governments guaranteeing the debts of private companies in order to get appropriate investment, right? And it doesn't really show on the books, but this debt potentially could be there, right? The prior solution that the government officials used, whenever you run into budget troubles, you have a lot of land to sell, you send this land to real estate investors, and they in turn this land into houses, into apartments, into high-rise buildings. But this doesn't seem to be available to China anymore, given the real estate crisis that started in 2021 and exacerbated in roughly 24, right? So the new solution that the government of China is engaging in is what is called zero-based budgeting. And essentially, again, I'm not an accountant. I play one on TV or, in this session, I suppose. But the idea of a zero-based budgeting is when you plan for the next fiscal year, you don't start with the current budget and build in some increase, like say increase it by 2% the various budget items. But what you start from zero and you justify every single expenditure. And by doing so, you could identify inefficiency. You can just determine how to close duplicative programs and things like that. And zero-based budgeting is obviously much more time intensive. It's a tougher process. I used to work at a higher education institution that moved to the zero-based budgeting approach, and that was a bit of a tough transition initially, which resulted in significant organizational turmoil. But overall, I think it was good for the organization. And so China is hoping that this is going to be good for China as well, but we'll see if this plays out as well as they think it might be, right? But the idea here is that this zero-based budgeting sort of looks like the Trump administration Department of Government Efficiency, or the DOGE initiative, right? We were trying to figure out where we can save more money and how we can become more efficient. Moving on to the idea of deflationary fears. Overinvestment, as Hadi noted in his presentation, creates quite a bit of a potential for deflation. And let me ask you this, and folks, feel free to unmute yourself and come on. Why do you think the economists fear deflation so much? What's the big issue with the price levels actually decreasing? Anyone? Any thoughts here?
Well, would that mean that, I guess, demand is going down then, right?
Well, yes, that's one of the concerns, right? And Lauren, so what would be the connection between deflation and demand? Why would demand potentially decrease if deflation is present in the economy?
Well,
Not to put you on the spot.
No, I mean, I've been looking at some news and I'm curious why, the demand hasn't gone down. And I'm assuming, so if demand were to go down, it would either have to be people have run out of money or access to money. something to stop them from being able to either afford more or want more, I think.
Yeah, that's absolutely a part of it. You're absolutely correct. And what deflation does here is that it essentially creates the expectation that prices will continue falling in the future. And if that's the case, if you are a typical consumer, if you're a typical business person planning for a significant investment project, you might say to yourself, look, if I buy a new car now, they're cheaper than they were before, but I think they're going to get cheaper still next year. And so we are going to postpone purchases, right? If we start postponing our purchases, that means GDP growth decreases, potentially becomes negative. Firms are going to be hit very hard by something like that. So in turn, firms start firing people. If we have an increase in unemployment, that also means that everybody else now starts spending even less because they're worried that they might be next on the chopping block, right? If you're seeing your neighbor getting laid off, even if your company is doing okay, right? Even if you think that your job is relatively safe, there's still this bit of a psychological issues. You're starting to worry that I might be next. And so the typical response to something like that, not universally, but by many consumers, is to spend less and save more, right? And sort of doing that essentially creates a vicious spiral, a vicious cycle where deflation leads to a decrease in aggregate demand, which leads to a decrease in production and economic growth and higher unemployment. And that continues spiraling. And that could spiral for a while, as the case of the Great Depression in the United States had shown to us, right? And so that's our real worry. So that's why when economists are looking for inflation target, they like to see some inflation. That inflation has to be low, it has to be predictable, it has to be stable. And this creates kind of this optimal recipe for the economic growth and helps us avoid this recessionally vicious cycle of deflation followed by decreases in GDP, followed by layoffs, and so on and so forth. Vivian, you wanted to say something too? Go ahead.
I was about to say this, like, is that kind of similar stuff as you mentioned that if the price would get lower, I would rather wait for my next purchases. Why do I have to pay it right now, right? It's gonna be
That's right.
cheaper, right?
Uh-huh.
So as you mentioned, it's gonna start the negative cycle altogether. And
Mhm.
I actually wanted to ask a different question. So
Mhm.
as
Sure.
you can see that things are getting kind of interesting, a lot of debt, things like that. So what is the non-performing rates, non-performing loan rates, NPL ratio of the banks right now? The reason I ask about it is because my previous firm has been investing in Chinese non-performing loans for the past
Mhm.
16 years. So I mean, up to last year, so I was a little bit more familiar with what's going on in China. The
Mhm.
non-performing loan ratio is always an indication of how aggressive the government is going to combat the bad debt in the system,
Mhm.
but that cycle always kind of comes and goes, never really plays out significantly. So there's a tremendous amount of debt in Chinese economy for sure.
Mhm. Yeah, it's an excellent question. And it's also a question where I may not give you a very good answer because on the business side, those numbers are relatively opaque and there is a
Mm-hmm.
good amount of distrust about some of the numbers that are reported by the government. We know that the government essentially told lenders, many of whom are state owned, not to be aggressive in collecting from businesses and from consumers during the COVID timeframe, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which really didn't help very much this issue because opacity and the lack of information. This is one of those things that can create your very your classic information problem where if you don't have enough information to assess what is going on, you're going to discount the prices that you're willing to pay for assets for the non-performing loans, right? And sort of that opacity creates your typical setting where where you basically get to the problem that was discussed in the market for lemons article, right? Essentially, the idea is that the good assets will disappear from the market, from being traded in the market, and the quality of the assets that will get traded is going to get worse and worse and worse. And as they get worse and their purchasers revise how much they're willing to pay for those assets, it keeps contributing to something like this, right? So to me, kind of like the major problem is not necessarily the presence of bad loans, but rather the opacity that suggests those bad loans. There is a little bit more information on the bad loans on the consumer side, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. But you're absolutely right that something like this essentially requires proprietary information that is difficult or expensive to come on, to find, right? Sort of people who are politically connected, who have access to something that's not visible to your typical investment community can do better than others, but still it creates significant problems. And this problem created significant problems. If you look back at Japan's lost decade, this was this festering wound that existed until sort of the government started taking more progressive action on separating bad loans from the bank's portfolios, and essentially created this bad bank that held a lot of those non-performing loans, right? Okay. Let me, in response to all of this, China's government created this concept of involution, which is the idea if you continue investing into industrial capacity, which is imbalanced if you aggregate demand, that creates cutthroat competition. And this cutthroat competition is this involution that results in deflation. And the government is actually, instead of telling firms like the Trump administration is telling them not to increase prices, the government in China is telling firms not to decrease prices, right? So there is significant idle capacity in multiple industries like electrical machinery, steelmaking, glass, cement, ceramics. Obviously, real estate is one of those things, right? And the government keeps telling those folks, don't decrease your prices. This is a problem that happened before, roughly 10 years ago, from 2012 to 2016. And the way how Chinese government dealt with that is that it created production quotas. So you could produce no more than this amount. It cut capacity in those industries where the aggregate demand and aggregate supply were imbalanced. It put on energy efficiency requirements, which forced older plants out of business. And the current solutions are basically a combination of the old solutions. There's a social mandates for self-discipline and not to decrease prices. There's a price floors, there's a capacity controls, local governments are withdrawing some of the subsidies. So the Chinese government is borrowing some things from its past playbook, and they'll see how effective it's going to be. But the big problem is that on the aggregate demand side, it's the real estate crisis that hurts so much, right? You can recall, and I'll talk about this in a moment, but sort of the idea of the government is to try to, in addition to supply side reforms that stabilize aggregate supply, we want to stabilize the aggregate demand. If we can restore the consumer confidence, that should help. And figuring out how to fix the real estate sector is going to be big, but there is still not a very good set of solutions out there. And so we know in high income economies, consumer spending tends to be the engine of GDP growth. In China, that's not the case, right? Sort of in China, the consumer spending accounts for roughly two-thirds of what it would have been in high income economies. So, for example, in the United States, it's around 70%. In China, it's actually closer to probably 45% or so. And again, the numbers are relatively opaque, so there's a very general numbers, but this is much less than in high income economies. And so if you want to grow in the past, you want to kind of figure out how to increase that consumer spending, but it's really tough. One of the reasons why it's tough, it's a household debt. Household debt used to be something like only 11% of GDP back 20 years ago. Now it accounts for about 60% of GDP. If you look at the defaults and maybe what we call near defaults, so people who are close to defaults, this is basically double of what it used to be. It's 5 to 7% of total population, which is population, I think, above 15 years of age. But this is still extremely significant for China. Paradoxically, a high savings rate is something that contributes to that, because when people feel uncertain, they increase their savings rate. And so savings rate in China is 32% of disposable income, which is huge compared to the United States, a lot of other economies. But much of it goes into real estate, which had been the main investment tool for the future for individuals. And some of it goes to struggling family businesses because there's simply no social safety net. The equivalent of China's social security system had been reformed back about 15 years ago, but to this day, not everybody is even eligible to participate. So you have to rely on your real estate as the main investment instrument, and it also accounts for about 2/3 of consumer borrowing. And of course, if you look at the debt collection practices, they're extremely poorly regulated. There is, for example, an example of social credit blacklist, meaning that if you don't pay your loans, you will be put on this blacklist that will not allow you to travel on planes and on high-speed trains. It's kind of like you're being ostracized socially. Collection practices are simply not regulated well, and could be extremely abusive and could involve shaving debtors, at their workplace amongst the neighbors, right? On the hope that if you do that to somebody, they will be more likely to pay up. And there is simply, not a strong personal bankruptcy legal framework, right? There's been some local governments in China that had put together some of those laws, but they, generally speaking, don't seem to be giving a good chance to people to start anew. And if you take into account that the creditors to consumers are very often state-owned enterprises, that kind of goes back to the government spending and the challenges of increasing balance sheets for the governments, if increased liabilities, that a big portion of which are unlikely to be collected. So all of those things present a very significant limitation for China. And it remains to be seen how well the state is going to be able to resolve something like this. This is actually it from my presentation. So let me stop sharing. And Hadi, I had a bit of a question for you. So given all of those issues and the falling price levels in China, is that something that the United States is actually benefiting from right now in terms of its own price levels?
Yes, I think that is helping. For example, the tariffs that Trump has been trying to impose on China, because prices in China are going down, the net impact on the US consumer is much less. So in fact, when Chinese prices go down, consumers in the US benefit from that. The tariff has come in between and reduced that benefit, or put it somewhat differently, the price may be slowly going up in the US, and the price of the same products are going down in China, and the difference is the tariff that the government of the US is collecting. We could have had lower prices if the tariffs had not been there. And you're going to see, of course, the impact of the tariffs in the next 6 months, a lot more. But as far as imports from China are concerned, the impact has been moderated by the fact that Chinese prices are falling.
So in some ways, it had been a saving grace for the United States price level so far. But and we talked about that during our July session, right?
Yes.
Sort of that was a great discussion. But you're already starting to see, sort of like our predictions were is that price levels will start increasing, and they'll start increasing soon. And I think we are seeing already very strong signals that this is starting to happen already, even despite the challenges that China are seeing. Tariffs is starting to affect the consumer prices in the United States. They're certainly affecting producer prices a lot more already. And so producer price increases are precursors to consumer price increases as well. Folks, we're
Let me
happy.
also add that
Go ahead,
let
please.
me add that the fact that prices were falling in China were already might have prompted Trump to be a lot more aggressive on the tariff side.
Mm-hmm.
So these are not independent events. They're all interconnected. China tries to be proactive, overinvest because they don't want their prices to go up and lose competitiveness. So that was the idea, or part of the idea of China trying to be competitive in the world markets. But then that overcapacity causes deflation in many industries, like, for example, steel industry, they have overinvested, and also housing overinvested. And that was good for China for a while, but then when it comes to deflation, it becomes really dangerous. And they have also built, as you said, huge debt, which
Mm-hmm.
then makes it difficult that takes away the government's flexibility in increasing expenditure and saving the economy. But that also had an impact on the US economy because the US was losing competitiveness, and the reaction by the government and some politicians and parts of the population is to put these tariffs to prevent the cheap goods from coming in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right, folks. Happy to take your questions and comments. Please go ahead. Vivian?
Well, I was thinking about as an investor, all the information asymmetry that you talked about could be an advantage for investors. Whoever were able to get that information will be at their advantages. Like you talked about the non-performing loans for individuals, right? But for corporations, corporate debt could be a significant problem or is already being a significant problem. So whoever who is able to get hands on those, it's a good time to invest. Honestly, I mean that's from an investor's perspective, right? And I do want to ask like how the debt situation will play out in the future. I have heard about this, like the government was gonna buckle, things like that. But in China, it's a very different system. It's very closed. It's state-owned, and the government has pretty much all the levers they wanted to pull, to get things going. And as long as they can pay the debt, right? It's just like nothing's gonna happen, honestly. So sometimes I look at it as long as that somebody can come up with the cash to pay for the debt, and then they just keep going, and then they're just gonna kick the can down the road. So that's why I never think that was gonna be a huge problem.
Well, this is a good point because, China obviously is a sovereign government, right? Its debt is a lot of its debt is basically denominated in the local currency, right? Sort of this is yuan. And this is also the currency that they can print. So they're not between a rock and a hard place like a smaller economy that borrows in foreign currency would be, because you can't print dollars, but you can print yuan, right, if need be. So for China, obviously the potential for crisis would not be as pronounced as it would be for a country like Lebanon, where so much of its borrowing essentially had been in foreign currency, and so that is a plus. But that still means that the potential for adjustment is still significant, and it still could be fairly painful, especially given the scale of the crisis in many industries that could be happening at the very same time, which started with real estate, right?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, we'll see. But as an investor, it's always a very good time to invest in their non-performing loans. So we'll see.
Yeah, I think if you have access to information that others don't have, and this is where this business intelligence comes in considerably, sort of asymmetric information can contribute considerably to decline in economic performance, but it can benefit individual players that have access to proprietary information that others don't have.
What?
Go ahead.
This Anil. Yeah. So I have two questions, like a two-part question. One question is like, how reliable is the data that we are getting out of China in terms of the identification of the GDP growth, or like that's number one. Number
Mm-hmm.
two is, as we all know, the tariffs back and forth, and then President Trump has levied a big fat tariff on India. So, like, what would be the expectations of all these factors weighing in on China's economy going forward?
Mm. Let me answer, the first part of your question, reliability of information. I think information, special information about key macroeconomic indicators is more reliable than it has been in the past because China had been known to fudge the numbers quite a bit. And kind of they did it both ways, right? Sort of they reported lower growth in very high growth years, and they reported higher growth in lower growth years, right? Essentially, what they're reporting was, sort of absence of those zigzags. So they would kind of shrink those zigzags in official statistics. But if you look at the alternative measures of GDP, and there's been, sort of at least a couple of frameworks for measuring that I know of, it seems like they're doing either a better job in reporting accurate information, or they learned how to fudge the numbers in a more credible way, right? In terms of the second question and the zigzagging tariffs, um, so we've talked about that during the last session. And so, sort of so far, there have been a number of factors that moderated the impact of tariffs on the United States, including a relatively low proportion of imports in the US consumption. Because remember, even if you're, consuming good that has been made abroad, probably a bigger chunk of its value is still connected to services associated with this good that are performed in the United States. So from this perspective, we've been sort of blessed. Plus, sort of you're getting the benefit of things like falling price levels in China that allow China to decrease their prices and to share the pain of tariffs at the U.S. consumers. But on the other hand, the instability of those policies doesn't really contribute much to business planning. And for a lot of businesses, that means that there is a Russian expression of sorts that basically says somebody having 7 Fridays in 1 week, right? Uh, Loosely translated, it basically talks about sort of the difficulty of doing business with somebody where everything changes daily, right? And so that doesn't contribute to business confidence, obviously, and that doesn't help economic growth. So we're starting to see, more pressure on producer prices in the United States, which tells us that inflation will probably pick up a bit. Investors obviously are not loving the interference with the independence of the Federal Reserve, which seems to be intensifying a bit. So that doesn't help confidence. And if businesses are not confident about what will happen in the future, they're probably not terribly likely to invest more, right? And so I think those chickens, they have yet to come home to roost, but they'll be coming home one by one, right? Unless something changes. So that's my perspective here. I don't know if I answered your questions.
Good.
Hadi, what's your take? And Anil, what's your own take?
No, I am. So this is my other question is, even though we are talking about China right now, so there's something going on with India, right? So we have a 25% tariff, and then the oil purchase from Russia, which
Mm-hmm.
amounts to, like, India has about 1.4 billion population. It has feed its energy needs, but so the point the question I'm trying to ask here is, like, if Heidi, you can also give your advice if you are an economic advisor to the government of India, and be like, should India be opening up its markets of the agriculture the milk products, and all of which is basically the vote bank for most of the parties, like political parties in
Mm-hmm.
India.
Mm-hmm.
And my take on the question is probably China is going to much diversify its global markets, especially to Southeast Asia, and it has made a lot of inroads into the Vietnam, Thailand, like all that Southeast Asian Polynesian countries,
Mm-hmm.
which basically it's a big market in itself. Like if you take the BRICS plus Southeast Asia, it's roughly 70, about the 60% to 65% of the GDP.
Mm-hmm.
So that's and if it is playing into that market, so I care about US. So that would be my take. Like most countries would be playing it safe,
Mm-hmm.
playing it behind the scenes to probably fool the emperor,
Mm-hmm.
or
Oh,
like give a gold coin or gold thing to 24
mhm.
karat gold and make him. So that's my
So
take.
I think for a lot of countries and a lot of governments, the reaction, given the oscillation in political winds, is to kind of to sit it out and not muddy up the water too much by doing anything that's sort of exceptionally disruptive. And even the threats of increasing the tariffs on India, sort of in response to buying Russian oil, it also seems that an agreement might be coming up soon, right? Things change very, very rapidly. So I think the natural reaction for nearly every single country is to sit it out, find ways to say something nice to the United States government and to the president more specifically, right? And see which way the wind blows. In terms
And
of India opening up its markets, to comment on the second part of that statement, generally speaking, India is still extremely overburdened by inefficient regulation and inefficient justice system. And so, from this perspective, doing things that fixes those infrastructure issues, making the justice process more effective, making competition easier, and allowing firms to get some economies of experience, economies of scale and scope. I think probably would be a good thing, right? Because in the very end, it is the Indian consumers who suffer from a lot of this, right? Um, so sort of stopping those artificial transfers of wealth from consumers to producers through this regulation probably would be a good thing, right? Again, I think, sort of maybe not doing everything at once, right? Sort of because it's really this big scale disruption that can be pretty negative. But, starting to take some of those steps might actually be a blessing for India's economy.
yeah. So I myself doing some business in India, and then like
Hmm.
sort of export things out of India. So the
Hmm.
mood in the country has been that for 200 years we have been dictated by one white guy.
Hmm.
And then and now we don't want to be dictated by other white guy.
Hmm.
So we need I think you got the picture, right? So yeah, so we don't want to be dictated, and the infrastructure wise, it is improving quite a bit. Like if you've seen the roads from Mumbai to Pune, but still it's a long way to go.
Hmm.
It's a lot of inefficient process out there, and it's not a quick fix,
Hmm.
and things won't change overnight. And it's been a lot to be done. So it's always like one. So the South India thinks in one direction, and North India thinks in different direction. So
Hmm.
that's the kind of political problems. But when it comes to unity, I think pretty much India stands in one voice. I guess no more white guy dictating us.
Hadi, anything?
Just let me add something. A few weeks ago, I read an article about tourism in India, which is
Hmm.
picking up very fast because of this infrastructure improvement. And I think that's an incentive for the government to work on that harder, to bring tourists to all of India. There are many places that tourists don't go very often because the infrastructure is not as great, as good as it should be. But now they're fixing that problem.
Yes, it is a fix. Thanks, guys.
Anup, go ahead.
Yeah, hi. I just want to add that actually the main thing I feel is important is the interdependencies of the US with other countries.
Mhm.
As far as India specifically is concerned, the dependency lies more in the service sector than the product sector. And so, yes, the tariffs would hurt um, the other countries a lot, but it will hurt less for the economies that rely more on the service sector of the country than the product sector that is vis-a-vis China.
Mhm.
So that's one of the points that I wanted to add. If you really wanted to penalize some other country, you attack the dependency of that country. But I don't think that is happening right now. So it's a much bigger problem for China, like you guys mentioned,
Mhm.
than it is for other countries.
Mhm.
Good point.
Point.
Good point. There are a lot of services that India is exporting, and there's no tariff on them.
That is correct. Yes.
Mhm.
Yes.
It's at least so far, Trump it doesn't seem to have gone that way. Any services that you outsource from India, those are not taxed, and that's an advantage for India because it actually sells more services to the U.S. than goods.
Yes, yes. And I think if I'm not mistaken, the most of the product or commodity that uh, there is a dependency between US and India is more in iron and steel.
Yes,
So yes, that sector may suffer, but in terms of broad economy, which is more service-based economy, um, I think it may still be okay. And then there is a lot of internal demand as well. It's a country of 1.3 billion people with a rising middle class, with a more expendable incomes. So there is a lot of internal demand within the country itself. So they don't have to look outside for growth.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Right. And they should take advantage of that as much as possible.
Right. Yes.
All right. Good deal. Folks, any other
All
comments or
right.
questions? Well, seeing that there are none so far, thanks very much for joining us. It's much appreciated. Sorry for our audiovisual difficulties in the beginning. I think I'll probably need to get a new laptop soon. But glad to have you all here. If there is ideas for future sessions, please let us know. Share with us on the group page on LinkedIn, and hope to see you soon.
Yeah, hope to see you in iConverge.
Yes, yes, I'm personally going to be there. So if you have a chance to make it to iConverge in September, I should be there for a couple of days, and I hope to see you there as well.
Great.
All right, thanks
Thank
all.
you.
Where is
Thank
the
you.
iConverge?
So iConverge this time is going to be in Shambana, and it's scheduled, I think, for the 11th through 13th of September, if I recall correctly.
Professor Hardy, will you be
Good.
able to make
Thank
it there?
I'm not sure. I was thinking that if it's somewhere that is accessible, more accessible than Champagne or Champagne, that might be.
Yeah, if you can make it there and Flat is there, maybe we can have our macroeconomics hour there in person.
All right,
That's a
yeah,
good.
that's we'll look
Hopefully,
into this if
hopefully
that's
one
a
day we'll do that.
possibility.
I
All
think
right,
that's a great idea. But all right, thank you. Thank you.
all right.
Thank you
Well,
so
thank
much
you,
for
everyone,
joining.
and
Bye-bye.
talk to you
Bye.
soon. Bye bye.